I'm Rachel Ann Goodman, and you're tuned to Talk of the Bay on KSQD Santa Cruz. I'm excited today to be joined by two people who are part of a walking tour, a walking audio tour of the Tannery Arts Center, which was once the Salts Tannery. And it has a long and venerated history in the community of Santa Cruz that goes way back. So we're going to talk about that history and also how it's being brought alive through the use of audio clips by these two audio artists who I'm going to introduce. They are part of Extent, and it's a collaboration between Kathleen Aston and Yulia Gilich, who are my guests today. Kathleen is the collections manager at the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. She holds a Master's of Library and Information Science from the University of Washington, with professional experience in natural history collections, public libraries, community archives, and oral history projects. Yulia is a media artist, theorist, and community organizer. They received an MFA in media arts production from the State University of New York at Buffalo and are currently a PhD candidate in film and digital media here at UC Santa Cruz. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're really excited about it.
Thank you. And Case Good's excited. We're actually a neighbor of the Tannery. We our radio station lives about 3 blocks away from you on Encinal Street. So we're very excited to have this opportunity to talk with you. The Tannery, let's start with the history of the Tannery itself and go back in time. It didn't used to always be the Tannery Arts Center. In fact, it's had a longer life as a working leather tannery. Can you talk about when that was in business, how many people worked there? Just set the scene for us a little bit about what was happening right next to the San Lorenzo River for a long time here in the city.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually maybe would like to start even before it was an industrial salt tannery when we think about this history, because we are on unceded indigenous lands that are ancestral lands of the Waswa-speaking Ohlone people, and they are the original tanners of this area. Their tanning process was different than the one at Salts Tannery, but I think it's important to also trace this lineage of the site that we're looking at.
There were certainly a lot of deer here to be turned into leather, both for shoes and other accoutrements. Maybe even housing was used for shelter. So yeah, it goes back even
right,
further.
Absolutely. But also, leather tannery, when it was an industrial tannery, used cow hides that was transformed into leather through the tanning process. But cows have been introduced to California with, as a result of Spanish colonization, right? Their cows are not native to California. And so it's interesting how I think this landscape and this process kind of transformed alongside the history of colonialism.
Well, certainly the process was different for sure. And one required lots of chemicals, which we'll talk about, the kind of the environmental legacy of commercial tanning operation right next to a river, which we will get to. But I would like to include Kathleen and ask you to comment on the early history of that site, which is about 8 acres, correct?
Yeah. And I appreciate that you were transitioning just then to the river, because that was the thing that I was going to talk about. A theme that when we started the project, we were really looking to use labor and two very different kinds of labor that come together in the history of that space, like tanning labor and then creative labor of artists who are live work artists or have studios there now. We were looking to use labor as a lens to look at all these other intersectional issues that shape our lives. And a theme that emerged really quickly from everyone was the river, the surrounding physical environment, which we really appreciated because I think it does reflect the way that landscapes interrelate with us and we shape our lives and we shape them. And the river was a really important part of indigenous culture here in Santa Cruz and lifeways. And then the river also is a really important part of Santa Cruz's industrial history. It is what made this such an ideal site for so many different forms of industry. And so that was that would be the thing that I would add to Yulia's great solid foundation there is how much the river is a part of this story and has been the whole time.
And you have audio clips. So
Yeah.
the project is a walking tour with audio. And Valentin Lopez is one of the people we hear from. And we're going to hear a little clip right now of him talking about, what was happening when the Ohlone people lived here and when the Amamutsan were on the property. So let's give a listen to him talking about the early days of this spot in Santa Cruz County.
The Uipi tribe that was there, they spoke the Awaswas language. The Awaswas language is spoken by 8 other tribes that lived in the greater Santa Cruz area, from Aptos up north to Pescadero and to the Santa Cruz Mountain ridgeline. There were 8 tribes there, and those 8 tribes spoke the Awaswas language, so they were connected by language. What's really important for people to know is there's no survivors from any of those 8 tribes. All descendants of the Awaswas speakers have died as a result of that brutal conquest. And so, we want people to understand the humanity of the people that were here first and how important they were to the area, what they contributed to that area.
It's not very often we hear Native voices talking about, contemporary things, but connecting the present with the past. And when you were talking about labor, I don't think people thought of it as labor. It was just a way of life. They weren't getting paid, something abstract like money to tan hides or kill deer. And that all changed with, like you said, cattle coming into the county with colonial settlers, and then later this whole industrial space that we now think of as the Tannery Arts Center, which was the Salts Tannery. So it's nice to hear that voice in this piece. Tell me who else you got to interview about the early days of the tannery once it became this site. You have some voices from workers, and there were a lot of workers. Do you know how many were there at the beginning of the tannery, or even at its heyday?
I think it really varied throughout so the industrial leather tannery operated on the site for 145 years continuously. And, as an industrial site, it had kind of ups and downs in terms of commercial success. And I think the numbers of workers also changed depending on conditions of the market.
And you have a couple of people who are descendants of the original owners of the tannery, Jeremy and Matt Lezen. They talk about, they say something about where there's leather, there's trouble. What do you think they meant?
As Norman, our father, used to say, where there's leather, there's trouble. And he's right, because there's so many things that can go wrong with leather. The weight, which is the thickness, the temper, which is how hard or soft it is, the color, the smell. I mean, it's an infinite number of problems.
The history of the tannery is incredible and rich, and there is an existing history exhibit on the Tannery campus, and they do a great job of making those resources available on the Tannery Arts Center website. And so oftentimes our project takes the form of really interviewing people and then some experts about sort of like personal experiences of how they related to like their work life. And so one worker that we had that we interviewed, Mike Reedy, talks about how important the tannery was as an employer, especially for folks who didn't have a college degree. Especially at the time that he was working there, you could have this sort of entry-level job and work your way up and be able to buy a house and raise a family in Santa Cruz. And so I don't have the statistics of the significance of employment based on numbers off the top of my head. And Yulia is right, it fluctuated a lot. But really just thinking about it as like one of the key places where you could get that kind of a job, and how important that was in making it possible for certain kinds of folks to find Santa Cruz more livable.
Well, and we're also, don't forget that there was the Wrigley's gum plant here. And so the smell of peppermint probably overlapped the smell, which I heard it was really like horrible, of the tannery and its processes, because they had to like lay these hides in a bath of some sort of acid. I don't know the details, but it was supposedly the stinkiest plant anywhere in Santa Cruz. So I imagine Santa Cruz was a much different place when you could get a job at the gum factory or the tannery.
And Mike Reedy talks about his decision as a young person. He was like working a job at the boardwalk and like needed to like be more established. And he was like, all right, do I go Wrigley's or do I go Tannery? And in the full length oral history that we'll have up on our website once we finish editing the transcripts over the next couple of months, you'll be able to hear him like puzzle out that decision. And the smell is always a very prominent part of the story.
The clip that we have from Mike Reedy is precisely him describing his job interview, which just consisted of staying at the tannery for the length of the interview, which was about 30 minutes, after which he got hired solely based on the fact that he didn't throw up, he didn't pass out, he tolerated the smell just fine. And that was the condition of working at the tannery, which I think is a really interesting kind of job interview story.
Yeah, let's hear that clip right now. We'll take a listen to his story.
My job interview was, I was working at the boardwalk and decided I didn't want to keep going to Cabrillo at the time. So I was 20. My mom was a nurse for the doctor's office that did the physicals, and she said, go to the tannery, I heard they're hiring. The gentleman who was interviewing me had worked at the boardwalk, so we were talking about different people we knew, and he kept me there for about a half hour and then said, okay, I think we're going to hire you. And I said, well, why? He said, well, you didn't get sick in standing there because the smell was so bad.
This is KSQD and Talk of the Bay. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. I'm speaking with Kathleen and Yulia about a project they're doing, which is a walking tour, audio tour of the Tannery Arts Center and its history, which is goes a ways back as part of this town's history as well. And we talked about the sensual aspect. Kathleen, you said you're interested in the river. So tell me about the environmental story of the Tannery Arts Center. The tannery itself left a pretty deep chemical wound on the property. And I heard that originally they would just dump these chemical baths right into the river. So what do we know about its legacy?
Sorry to speak over you. But so the river is a big part of what made industry possible in Santa Cruz. And like the placement of this tannery site on the river was so that they could use it as a resource, largely for being able to get waste to move away from the space. And rivers and tanneries having this really like difficult negative relationship is a big part of why they were one of the first industries to be focused on by the EPA's regulations when that entity first came into being. And it was just kind of generally recognized that one thing I do want to say is that like the river is what made that kind of whole process possible by being able to be a vehicle for waste, but you still have this really interesting negotiation of the value of the river from early industrial folks. We have a clipping in our installation, or we have a voiceover of a news clipping in our installation that talks about the president of the tannery. I think it's the 1930s or 40s, Yulia, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, talking about how the city should dredge the river because the river is being a menace to the tannery because it is flooding the tannery.
Tannery president asks city to dredge river. A.K. Saltz, president of the Saltz Tannery on River Street, today petitioned the city council to dredge out the mouth of the San Lorenzo River to permit a free flow of water and prevent flooding the lowland in the tidewater area. The river, he said, was a menace to the tannery property.
And thinking about how wow, this thing that has made your whole industry possible, you're not now mad at and want to be completely dredged and fully removed from your site. In the later years of the tannery, after transitions between different kinds of tanning processes, so transitioning away from traditional tannic acid type tanning to a process called chrome tanning, and transitioning to having that initial heavily chemically laden process happen closer to the sources of the leather, closer to slaughterhouses, made the chemical makeup of the space really different. And in later years, folks who were involved in that part of the tannery's life worked a lot on different kinds of filtration mechanisms and worked with the city a lot on how to do better about like the environmental impact on the space. And we interviewed some folks, Tom Hoagie, who's really proud of his work doing that, and like later went on into working in like environmental regulations and like recycling type stuff because of that, his work at the tannery doing that. But it is still the case that when they were reviewing the site for the current live work spaces and studios, they had to identify all these major hazards and cap a bunch of different parts of the surface. They're not allowed to grow food plants out of the ground on that space because of this long history of like, industry poisoning the earth.
So they have monitoring sites still. And is it still considered a Superfund site yet to be cleaned up, or is it remediated, quote unquote, to its best ability? And now they just need to check and make sure it doesn't further come out?
Still a Superfund site. And the prohibition against growing food trees in the land is still standing. So if you pay attention to like how vegetation and trees and the little garden that the live work artists who live at the Tannery Arts Center now are tending to, how they're growing from the land, or how they are situated on the ground, most of them are in raised beds or in kind of containers, because they actually cannot be in contact with the soil. And that resulted in a design choice to cover most of the ground on the Tannery Arts Center campus with a cement slab. So kind of aesthetically, that's one of the biggest elements that you notice when you were there. And a lot of people kind of commented on, the complex feelings they have about this aesthetic choice, but also the beauty of offering the kids who live on the Tannery campus a space to play basketball or to practice skateboarding. And so even though like this solution to cover the soil with cement is related to like the history of toxicity of the leather industry, the people who live there now like still find, beauty and like exciting community kind of opportunities from this complex history.
Right. Thank you for that, Yulia. I wanted to bring in the voice of Jessie Autumn, who used to live at the Tannery Arts Center. She was one of the first artists to move in there when they opened the site for living and working for artists, which is the next phase I wanted to talk about. But let's hear her for a moment talking about what it was like to be one of the first people to live there when people would come and ask the artists if they had any leather.
When we had the Dead Cow Gallery and we were doing those harp orchestra rehearsals, a couple times while we were there, folks hadn't really heard that it was becoming an art space yet, and they came in looking to buy leather all the time. And this guy, I'll never forget, this guy walked in and we're all playing, it's like this little, kind of harp thing going on. And he's like, yeah, I'm here to buy leather. And I'm like, do you notice something?
That's harpist Jessie Autumn, who lived at the Tannery in the Live Work apartments. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about the transition of this space from an industrial site to an artist colony. And that's another long story of planning, which we probably don't have time to get into. But in the short version, would one of you like to give that story? How did it turn into an art space?
Yeah, so we talked to a lot of different folks about sort of like the origin of this process, and the major takeaway is that it was like hugely complicated, and people were very invested in it. And sometimes the more I learn about these sort of bigger projects that get developed in Santa Cruz, I'm not even sure how they successfully happen. So that was our major takeaway. And I think one thing that there is one important player, in addition to like the city of Santa Cruz and others, is a nonprofit that is called Art Space, which specifically is invested in developing affordable housing for artists, and considering how important it is to be able to have folks who have like who bring creativity to a community. And so I think that we heard a lot of different people talk about how much they appreciated working with that nonprofit to like establish this entity, and how complex the discussion was specifically of how to advocate for affordable housing for artists in a town where people were like, but we also need teachers and we also need these other things. Like we do need everything, but we also do, I think part of what was happening is that people were recognizing that Santa Cruz has this really sort of like special creative community, and we're recognizing that we were on the verge of like losing that more and more because of the difficulty of being able to afford to live here. And so people were advocating for this solution so that Santa Cruz didn't lose that part of its cultural identity. And that conversation, it sounds like, was really like more complicated than I was originally expecting in terms of how to convince people that that was like a valuable thing to do. And the solution seems to have involved an artist called Kirby Scudder making a lot of really gigantic paper mache cows and wandering them around town to get people excited about this sort of like cute idea of turning this like once industrial space into something that like served the community in a different way. And they weren't even like the kinds of cows that get used for leather production. They were like dairy cows. And he just really, in his like narrative of this story, just really emphasizes that like people getting excited about this like cute, funny, interesting, surprising thing that they were seeing around town seemed to take the teeth out of, for a lot of folks, the complexity of like negotiating affordable housing for one of many different kinds of communities who needed it.
And in all fairness, I should say that I was the executive director for a while of the Tannery Arts Center nonprofit that was raising funds for the theater. So I had a very small, short role to play, but I was there at a very important time when the artist studios opened, and we had this big grand opening, which I helped organize. And so there's these three phases. There's the apartments that went in first. Those are the ones right by the river. And then there were these artist studios, which were market rate rental for artists. They aren't, free. They aren't like the housing subsidized, but it's given people a place to do their art in an affordable way. And then the third phase was this big theater. I think it's like a 200-person theater. And that, I think, is still yet to be fully activated. There's one theater company kind of in there doing its thing, but the original vision was a performing arts center where you'd have every kind of concerts and ballets, and every group that's here doing performing would be there. So I think that's still in the future. We could listen to a few more of these voices. We have a guy named Tom.
So Tom Hoagie is one of the former Salt's Tannery employees, who was so generous to give us a walking tour of the Tannery Arts Center, but tell us what it looked like when it was Salt's Tannery. And so I don't know, I think the experience of having this walking tour with former Salt's Tannery workers and people who knew the place before it became the Tannery Arts Center kind of mirrors the shape of the walking tour that we produced. That it, through moving through space, you're also kind of moving through time. And what I like about the clip from Tom Hoagie right here is that it thinks about the future of the space. So we asked everyone who we interviewed if they could design a perfect future for this place, and money is no object, what would it look like? And so Tom Hoagie's answer included kind of vision of rewilding.
Wow, well, there would be nothing 100 feet from the river. The river habitat would be completely restored. There would be woody debris in there. There would be beavers, because we've exterminated all the beavers from entire West Coast, which has wrecked all the river systems. So money was no option. I would first restore that. I would repopulate beavers to build dams, which then would give everybody downstream and upstream of that a headache, because there would be flooding for ponds, which would create silt and sediment, but cool ponds for steelhead to grow up.
Yeah, he mentions beavers who used to be there coming back. That's really exciting. A couple more voices before we run out of time. Linda Cover has been there in the artists' rental studios for a long time. She teaches children as a part of the Tannery Arts Summer Camp, and I loved what she has to say. So let's give a listen to Linda Cover.
So yeah, I get to in my studio. I get to look at the beams. It's at this structure. There's a little museum here. All the studios are unique because they had to carve studios out of the existing buildings. So I feel that. And then for me, one of the really compelling aspects of being in this location, this place, is the San Lorenzo River. And that superseded all of the industry. And of course they used that river not just for the tannery, and they did use that, they unbeknownst to them, or perhaps beknownst, they used a lot of contaminants that we still have today in the area. We've had to cap the land before they were allowed to build here. And it's still disintegrating.
And finally, if you would set up this last clip of Maha Tayetano, who is also a live work artist who lives at the tannery and does her art there. I'm not sure who that is, but maybe you could introduce that last clip for us as we close this conversation about the walking tour. And then we will get the information to you about how you might take this tour if you are visiting there.
Maha is an incredible artist, and we so appreciated being able to speak with her, being able to see her studio, and the fact that she was interested enough in our project to connect us to a bunch of the other live work artists that she works with. And I think that her experience as an industrial artist living and working in the tannery was really interesting and gives her sort of like a very interesting kind of engagement with the space and how it functions, because certain kinds of her art she isn't able to physically practice there unless she were able to like install a whole bunch of extra things. And she's also lived there and raised a family there at the tannery since the very beginning. And so she has a lot of really interesting perspectives, and this clip really underscores the complexity of like all the different entities and humans who have an investment in the tannery. And also we appreciate this clip because it brings us back to this imagery of the cow, which we think is has operated for so many different ways in the site of the tannery, that we appreciate kind of like the theme of the river, that was something that has carried forward and has held significance to so many people throughout this project.
I always wonder, was there any artist that was brought on to the design development part of the project, like when the architects met? And I know that definitely no artist or anybody who would actually live there was asked about the floor plans, because we don't have real walls or doors in our bedrooms. They're kind of just like open stalls. Where are the cows now?
Wonderful. I want to thank you both for being here, Kathleen Aston and Yulia Gilich, the authors of a walking audio tour. And how can visitors access this?
They should visit our website that's called extenttannery.com. And there you will find instructions about how to access the tour through your phone. So it's an interactive sound piece that you can hear through your phone. But there's another way you can listen to Extent, and it's in a form of a podcast. So again, on our website, extenttannery.com, there's a tab that will take you to listen to the podcast that we produced.
All right. Thank you very much for being here on Talk of the Bay. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.